And so we're joined now by Andrew Tettenborn, Professor of Law at Swansea University. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the program.
Good evening.
Andrew, good to see you. So let's take a wider optics recap here. So it was in Paris, then it was Belgrade, now it's Budapest. He started in an EU country, he's ending in an EU country. So what are your main observations, takeaways here from Xi Jinping's visit to Europe?
When it comes to Macron, I think it was basically to show that he was interested in visiting the Western countries in the EU. I'm not sure if he expected to get very much out of this. What is much more significant, it seems to me, is his visit to Budapest and also to one or two other places in Eastern Europe. He clearly sees a great deal of capital to be made in Budapest, and actually you can understand why this visit, in particular the one to Hungary, why this visit was very much to the advantage of both parties. Looking at it from the point of view of Viktor Orban in Hungary first, Hungary desperately needs investment, it desperately needs jobs, and that is exactly what China, which has a surfeit of money to be invested, that is exactly what China can provide. We have already seen the prospect of the Chinese company BYD building a major car plant in Szeged. And I think there's now the prospect of a major Chinese-owned electric car battery project in Debrecen. China gets enormous advantages from these because, of course, it gives them an entry to the European market. But you can see why Viktor Orban welcomes China. Also, Viktor Orban, I think, feels somewhat isolated in the European Union, in many cases with good reason, sometimes with bad. And if China comes along and offers the hand of friendship, he's quite likely to accept it with alacrity. The other calculation, and Xi Jinping is a very careful calculator. He's nobody's fool. The other calculation is that it is very much in China's interest, if it's possible, to reduce the unanimity of the EU, especially as the EU is already beginning to take what China sees as an unhealthy interest in its exports of things like solar panels and items of that sort. Insofar as China can do its best to detach one EU member state from the rest of the EU, it's something that China will very much want to do.
And this is exactly what I want to ask you about, because there is an expectation that around 16 to 18 new cooperation agreements are going to be signed. What does this dependency between Hungary and China and this relationship between the two that seems to be developing even further means for the European Union from the perspective of the EU member states, knowing very well that Hungary is one of the member states as well?
I think they need to be worried, as actually possibly in the long term Hungary does. Viktor Orban is a very clever man, but I think he may here have miscalculated slightly. But the EU certainly does not want to see a major Chinese presence in one of its member states. It equally doesn't want to see a member state of the EU feeling beholden to China. And one of the major projects being put forward, which didn't hit the headlines, is the new railway, or the proposed new railway, from Budapest down through the Balkan states to Athens. That will enormously increase China's clout in the region. The money to build it will not be given by China, it will be lent. And China does not have a particularly good record as a creditor nation. It will also, of course, give China a further advantage in infrastructure. China already owns the port of Piraeus. And if it can then say, well, we own the port and we own the infrastructure into the heart of Europe, this is something which I suspect the rest of the European Union should be rather worried about.
Exactly, and I think, but it seems to me a little bit like the same situation. If we go back a few years, 5 years ago, Claudia mentioned also about what does this mean for the EU. The EU had a different policy with China. We know we have 27 member states. We can kind of see that policy now very different if we look at what Hungary is trying to do. But there isn't, that's the question, what can Hungary realistically really do here? I mean, of course, fanfare and pageantry and certain investments, but you need more countries really to stop any sort of other EU trade policies, and Hungary cannot do that on its own. So how much of this is just basically a show, and how much does it show that the EU is still very united when it comes to policy of trade with China, or how do you assess that?
Well, Hungary can't as such do very much on its own, but again, it's a matter, as you put it right at the beginning, of the optics. If it becomes clear that there is at least one EU member state which is not marching in step with the rest of the EU when it comes to EU-Chinese relations, that will very much blunt the impact of any EU attack. And, for example, it could also blunt the impact of an EU diplomatic attack. Imagine China were to rattle the sword towards Taiwan. Now, the EU, if it has any decency, would immediately complain very loudly. Life would be a little bit difficult in Hungary if Hungary is considerably indebted to the country doing the saber rattling. That is why I'm a little bit worried about this, despite my admiration for, in a number of other respects, for Viktor Orban.
So it seems to be a little bit of a game of the tug of war between the EU and China over Hungary as a member state. Is there any way that you can think of that the EU could actually pull Hungary from the loving arms of China?
Yes. I think the EU has to realize that there is room for much more variety in the EU than the Western EU states are prepared to admit. It's begun to do this. It got a rude shock with Poland under PIS, and now with Hungary, who insisted on going their own way and not taking everything that the EU said for granted. The EU, if it has any sense, will now be, I think, very much more accepting of national independence and national independent policies within the EU. And indeed, this may happen almost naturally. We don't know what will happen, of course, in the upcoming European Union elections. But my spies tell me that it is very likely that the more right-wing parties in Europe will make major gains, and that may provide the impetus for a loosening of EU control, or what have up to now been fairly tight EU controls over the internal affairs of member states.
Also, really briefly at the end, I mean, we touched on this already a little bit about wider EU policy, and it's also, we're looking and waiting about a month now exactly till European elections, but also we have that EU rotating presidency that's coming up. July will be Viktor Orban's Hungary in charge of that. Now, that's one of the layers of a very complicated European Union institutional design, but just give us your take. Is this going to potentially also change the dynamics here in this relationship a bit? I mean, it is significant that Xi Jinping is in Hungary on his last stop before that. What do you make of it? Just briefly, Andrew, at the end.
I think it will. It will very much, I think, change the way in which all this is seen. Because the presidency wields a lot of power behind the scenes. And assuming that nobody manages somehow to prevent Viktor Orban taking over, and there seems precious little chance of that happening, I suspect that may be another contribution to the loosening of the hitherto very tight ties between the EU and its member states.
Right. Well, thanks you as ever. Wonderful insights there, Professor Andrew Tettenborn. Thanks for joining us today.